Well, thank you very much, Shane. It's a pleasure to be here. Some people say the title of my talk is an oxymoron. And for some people it is, but it doesn't have to be. And I hope I don't come across as too smart aleck when I say, is it possible? And the answer to that is yes, if you know how to do it. And there are a number of things that I think we grow up with a system of agriculture that was successful 40 years ago. And we keep trying to do that and maybe do all of those same things a little bit better, when maybe you need to change the things you're doing. Just making each little thing we've always done a little better doesn't always work so well. So if we can change the things we're doing and do some things that maybe help us along the way, and do things a little bit, and do things, I want to say a little bit better, but do different things and do them better. Did I jump 2 slides? I don't know which way I'm going here. There we go. Okay. Some things we need to understand. We ought to have some goals and a shared vision. If your ranch farm, and I'm going to talk a little more about ranches and cows and calves and that sort of thing, and I hope that whatever you have, the ideas can translate to some of the things you do. I've had an awful lot of experience with cows and calves. Alan said practical. I hope they are practical. For me, they became practical because I worked for a company managing ranches, and we knew several things going in. If I became a manager in that company, if my property were to lose money 2 years in a row, I was gone. Luckily, mine never lost money. I also knew that if they put another manager on the place and the property lost money with another manager that they thought was good, they would sell the property. I don't think we only sold one property, and we shouldn't have sold that one, but just never got the right guy there at the right time. But at any rate, most ranches can be profitable if we know how to do it. And I think we have to start with a shared vision. If you've got a team of people, even if it's you and your spouse and some of the kids, that's a team of people, and you need to see your long-term objectives the same way. What would we like this ranch to look like? Do we want it to be open savanna, rolling prairie? Do we want to have a tree here and there? Do we want it no trees at all? Do we want it to be grassland? Do we want to have farmland? Do we want to have grasslands and farmlands interspersed? Just vision, but we need to be able to share that vision. If we don't get to a shared vision, we're kind of at counter purposes with each other in our team. Now, it doesn't mean you have to agree 100%, but you can all be comfortable enough with that vision that you can all buy into it, and it can be your vision, so you can move together and accomplish what you want to accomplish. And I like financial goals, land and soil health goals, and financial goals. And I think if you've got goals in each of those areas, then you stand a very good chance of being profitable. And then we'll talk about what to manage, 3 ways to improve profit, and what I call the 5 essentials. Naturally, these 4 areas I think make sense. You look at those and you say, yeah, we got to manage that for sure. But I would guess that most of you are a little bit like me. I grew up and I knew I wanted a ranch, and I thought I wanted to be a ranch manager. Why? Because I loved cattle and I loved production. I liked to see if there's ways to make them more productive. And then my grandfather had me work on some range improvement. I got to be careful how I use that word improvement, because I'm not sure it did, but range improvement projects. And I got excited about them. I liked them, and the initial results were pretty darn good. I go back there now, which is a lot of years later, and it doesn't look like we did much good. But anyway, I enjoyed the production, making the range produce more, making the cattle produce better, and hopefully making it more profitable. But I was thinking production. Production is the thing I was focused on. That's what I enjoyed. That's what I liked. And I think a lot of us that are in agriculture are the same way. And so we have to be a little careful. We have to remind ourselves that we've got a business to run. So we have to take care of economics and finance. We have to do marketing, maybe a little better than we've done it before. I thought I was a pretty good marketer. I was doing the things that I'd learned in college, and I was doing things that I thought pretty good marketers did. And then I met some real good marketers. People who were kind of out of the box, but as soon as they explained to me what they were doing and I could understand that, and then why are they doing it, put the arithmetic to it, I discovered that particularly in the area of what I called cull cows, I was leaving $200 to $300 on the table for almost every one of those that I sold. And so I quit calling them cull cows and I started calling them market cows. And we started treating them that way, and I started picking up some of that $200 and $300 that I'd been leaving on the table. And we'll talk about a few things here later today, and not everybody's going to be able to use the same ideas I used, but I hope I can just give you enough ideas that you can start to think and press beyond where I was, or have other ideas that work equally as well, maybe better. Some of the people that I've consulted with, I've thrown out ideas to them, and they grab that idea, and the next thing I know, they've branched off of that idea and they're doing something better still. And so marketing can be a real intriguing area. And what I've learned is that for every $100 worth of time that I spent in marketing, I probably got at least $1,000 back. It's a pretty good return, you know. It didn't take a lot of time to do marketing in a little different way and get a huge return from that time and effort. Now, I'll be honest with you, I still don't really enjoy that kind of work. But I enjoy what it'll do for me, so I go ahead and do it. Like the result. And then people. Oftentimes people will ask me, well, gosh, there's just me and a spouse and a child or two. And sometimes I think those are the most difficult of the things we have to deal with, right? I worked with employed people. I worked with my children a little on a couple of family situations, but I didn't get to work with them very much. But you know what? It was more difficult to be a father in a family setting and a boss to those same kids in a business setting than it was to manage my people that weren't related to me, you know, in the ranching situation. So I think that's one area of management. We just have to recognize that if we really want buy-in from the people who work for us, work with us, we need to learn how to get that buy-in. And leadership is a term that I like to use along those lines. And then too, think of the relationships that you manage. Some of you here are on a board, maybe more than one board. You have people there that you interact with. If you have cattle, you probably have a feed salesman. If you're a farmer, you probably have a fertilizer and an input salesman, a tractor dealer, or who do you buy your pickups from? Who do you bank with? Who's your accountant? How do you get your accounting or bookkeeping done? Who does your tax preparation? All of these people, if you select them well, there are many of those people that can be helpful to you in business decisions that you make. And so you're not their manager, you're not their boss, but you can manage that relationship in such a way that that can be a very profitable relationship for you, a very helpful relationship for you. So 4 areas to manage. It's easy to look at and say, yep, maybe not quite as easy to do, but spend a little time in each one. And you can still focus on production because it'll still be the big payback if you do it right. But the others are important, and they all interact, they all tie into each other. What affects one affects the other, and vice versa. 3 ways to improve profit. And you're going to say, oh, there's more ways than that. And in the cow-calf business at least, well, cattle business of any kind, I'll suggest to you that that there might be other ways, but every one of them will feed into one of these, or two of them. First of all, increase turnover. And some people will say, okay, if I just buy another ranch and add to this, and that'll increase turnover. Yeah, that increases volume. I don't want to call that turnover. For me, turnover is having more to sell on the same size of operation. So how do I do that? When I got introduced to this and I started seeing the arithmetic behind it, I started thinking of all kinds of things that I could do to increase turnover. And let me just point to one. Up in Nebraska, I managed a pretty good sized operation, enough that we could take our cows that were 9 years old and older and put them in a herd by themselves. Called it our grandma herd. And that herd was 700 to 900 head of cattle, depending on the year and how many we had to move up because of age and how many of them we had to sell. And every year along about August, early August, we'd go into that herd in the early morning when they were kind of mothered up, and we'd look at a cow that had kind of a poor calf, and we'd say, hey, she's an old cow. If she can't raise any better calf than that this year, she's probably going to do worse next year. We'd ride them out. And we're all riding pretty decent horses, and we knew how to do that, and we'd just ride the pair out of the herd. And if the cow was starting to look a little junky, just starting to shell out a little bit, not taking good care of herself, hey, she's old, she's not going to get any better, we'd take her out. Fine, get her calf with her and take her out. Bad udders. Just things that we didn't like, and we were worried if she got another year in her or not, and if she does, is it going to be a very productive year, and we'd ride those away. Well, that'd be because of the old herd, that was our highest cull rate on the ranch, and we'd take them away. And we'd go, and the first thing we'd do is we'd cake those pairs about 3 days. And there's a reason we did that. We'd cake them about 3 days, and then we'd fence line wean them, and then we could cake the calves, and they knew how to eat cake because Mama had taught them, right? Mama didn't need the cake, but the calves would eat cake, and we could have the calves on pasture, cake them a little bit each day, and they'd eat the pasture. And doing that, they would do as good as the calves that were left on Mama would do. In the meantime, we'd give that cow about 2 weeks to tighten her udder back up a little bit and to look a little better, and then we'd sell her in late August or early September, and we were beating the fall market. She probably weighed between 100 and 200 pounds more than she would have in October or November, and sold for 5 to 10 cents more a pound, and left the feed behind that she would have eaten in that 2-month period of time. You see what I've done to turnover? And there's ideas like that all around that you can start thinking of. How do I change the turnover a little bit in my operation? And that's just one example. Decrease overheads. This is an easy one, but a tough one at the same time. Simultaneously tough and easy. Most of us fall in love with their overheads. We can't imagine getting away without needing that piece of equipment. But how many days a year do you really use it? And how important is it? And do I really need that extra pickup? And is that stock trailer, is it a status symbol or is it a necessity? And we've got to ask ourselves those kind of questions, and the answers get a little emotional with us. But they're answers that I've worked with on a consulting basis that were struggling to be profitable. We had to attack overheads first, and when they could finally toughen up with themselves and get rid of excess overheads, it made huge differences. They changed from losing money to making money. An overhead story. A young fellow that I brought to our ranch in Nebraska as a student intern came to us, and I could tell that he was good. So we got him hired right after he got out of college. Worked for us for a number of years. He worked for some of my colleagues and then later worked for me. And then he left our company and he went to work for some people managing a ranch near Saratoga, Wyoming. High elevation ranch. And he went there and the ranch was losing money. And not a little money, quite a little money. And the family that owned the ranch, it was kind of their retreat, and they could go there and hunt a little bit, and they just figured that that's the way it was, that was the price they paid to have their nice family retreat area. Well, when he came there, he didn't like the idea. I mean, he was fine with the family retreat. He just didn't want to have to keep coming out of their pocket to keep the retreat alive. He figured it ought to make a little money for him. Well, in about 3 years' time, he had it making as much as it had been losing. And in conversing with him, I said, "How'd you get that done?" He knew me fairly well, and he'd heard talks like this from me. And he said, "You know how I did it?" And I said, "Overheads?" And he said, "Yep." And he said, "Just the overheads." And I said, "Well, what overheads?" And he said, "Well, gosh, we were feeding cows 5 months of the year." And he said, "Yeah, we're 7,200 feet elevation." No, they're not quite that high, but over 7,000 feet elevation. And he said, "It does snow here." But he said, "It usually blows away or doesn't snow very much, or we'll get a warm few days or whatever." And he said, "We can graze most winters." He said, "We don't need to be feeding that much hay." And he got his crew together. He said, "We don't need to feed all this hay." He said, "If we don't need to feed all this hay, do we need all this haying equipment?" And he said, "There were a couple of them there that would, yeah, we can get along without this. We can do and he said, some of them were pretty participative, and some of them just, no, we got to have it. That's the way it is. You got to have it. You got to have this hay. No way you can get along without it." And so they went through this, and finally they got the hay thing cut way down. And, now they're doing a lot of swath grazing, a lot of grazing of standing material. They'll swath it if they think it's worth running the swather, just because the cows will work through the snow to get it when they do have snow. But so they started doing quite a bit of swath grazing. Do you all know what that is? You swath it, and then maybe you'll double or triple the windrows. If you double or triple the windrows, don't wait till it's completely dry. You got to combine those windrows while it's a little bit wet, or they will blow all over the world. And then you guys, you don't know what wind is here, though, do you? But anyway, if you want to do that with windrows, you got to do it while before they're completely dry. They still got to be damp, so they'll kind of tie together. And then, anyway, they did that. Well, so after they decided how much they could cut down on the haying, and later on they went even further. But then he said, "Okay, how about pickups and stock trailers?" Well, again, he had a couple of guys. "Yeah, we don't really need that. We don't use it that much." And a number of pieces of equipment. Now, what are the overheads? Overheads are these. Overheads are land and the facilities that are tied to the land. Houses, corrals, shops, etc. Grain storage. Anything that's tied to the land, they're overheads. We need overheads, right? Do we need them all? That's the question. Then the other overheads are people. Me, you, us, and our tools and equipment. We need overheads. But do we need them all? Which overheads do we really need? Which ones really contribute nicely to our profitability? So he went through all that, and he said, after I got done, he said, about half of my guys quit. He said, but I was lucky. The right ones quit. So his remaining overheads and his remaining people overheads were quality. They were the people that were going to help him and help moving forward and do it. And he never had to replenish that crew back to its original size. Well, you think a person, and I know their wages have gone up, but a $30,000 a year cowboy, and if you provide housing for him and a vehicle or a way to get around the ranch and do his work, keep some saddle horses, pretty soon that guy participating in insurance or health care one way or another, pretty soon that guy's costing you $100,000 a year. So you just didn't get rid of the salary, you got rid of a bunch of other stuff around that person. And so you see why overheads get to become really important, and that's why you have to ask yourself some serious questions, and sometimes the answer actually will get a little emotional with you. It'll get a little emotional. I know another guy that he always had a backhoe. He said, but we found out we were doing most of our backhoe work working about 2 weeks of the year because that's the only time we had time to go do the backhoe work. He said, now we just rent a backhoe or have a neighbor come and do it for us. And he said, then we don't have to be the ones that fix it when it breaks and all that other stuff, and it'll start when we get it. And so just those kinds of ideas are the kind of things that people get thinking about when they think about decreasing overheads. And then you want to improve gross margin. And gross margin is this. It's the total revenue from an enterprise, and you can do your structure enterprises however you want. Your whole cow deal can be an enterprise, or you can break it up into my mama cows and their calves, my yearlings, maybe stocker yearlings, maybe heifer replacement yearlings, or you can combine those. You can put it together any way you want. But it's the direct costs of that enterprise. It's the total revenue from that enterprise minus the direct costs associated with that enterprise. Now, the total revenue is the total cash receipts from the enterprise plus or minus the inventory change. You got to take that into consideration. A lot of people that I've done consulting with never did that. They just, how much cash did we take in? That's what their Schedule F on their income tax showed. How much money did we get from sales of cattle? But maybe you got $100,000 from the sales of cattle, but you got 50 more cows this year than you had last year. So you could have maintained a static cattle inventory and you'd have had 50 head more of something to sell. You'd have had more cash revenue. So you need to add the value of that inventory change to your revenue or subtract it if your inventory decreased during the year. And you can do that on stored feeds. But you need to take account that inventory change, and some farm accounts, ranch accounts will call that accrual adjusted revenue. And then you subtract from that the direct costs. And in cattle, the direct costs vary every time you change the number of cattle you have. And so those numbers are usually feed and vet and marketing and very little else. The rest of them are overheads. And that's why I have to get so emphatic about the management of overheads, because feed, vet, marketing. And those costs in many places aren't very great. Now, a lot of people spend an awful lot of money on feed, but if you can get grazing going on for a greater portion of the year, you don't have to spend nearly so much money on feed. So anyway, those 3 ways to improve profit. And anything you think of, any change you think of, is going to enter into one or more of these at the same time. Okay, now it's whole ranch profits you want to talk about, or profit per acre. Don't talk about profit per cow. Don't even talk about production per cow. And I know almost all the research you see that comes from the universities on cattle gets down to what effect does it have per cow? Got to be real careful. That can lead us down the primrose path. Let me just throw out a little example and see if you can log this in a little bit. If I've got 1,400 pound cows and I can run 100 of them, cows eat as a percentage of their body weight, not exactly, but almost. So that means I could run 140 1,000-pound cows. You all with me? I got 1,400-pound cows, or I can take 140 1,000-pound cows. Run them on the same feed resource. Going to eat about the same amount of feed. Okay, those 1,000-pound cows are going to wean calves that weigh less than the 1,400-pound cows, but not near proportionally less. And there's been some really good research to show that. So they're a little smaller, but there's a lot more calves. And so they're a little smaller, and as they get smaller, what happens to the price per pound? Goes up, doesn't it? So I can sell them for more per pound. I've got more pounds to sell, and I sell those pounds at a higher price if they're a little smaller. That's why we've got to be careful, and when we look at profit per cow, be really, really cautious. Because if I can run some more smaller cows, Now, you can get too small and they're no longer marketable and things like that unless you're direct marketing some way, but they can be too small, and we've got to watch out for that. But basically, the smaller the cow, then you can still sell a merchantable calf at a good price, or yearling, whatever, the better. And we've just got to watch out for that. So it's whole ranch profit. Same with your farming. You know, you want to look at your whole ranch. What's the whole thing doing together as you put together your crop rotations? But in the cow, that is really important. Now in cows, I think these are the big determiners of profitability. Major determinants. First of all, your enterprise choice and selection. Now, you could put into their crops and other things, but let me just focus on livestock. I could say, okay, what happens if I were to add sheep or add goats? Or substitute one for the other. We find people stacking enterprises, they find out they make a lot more revenue per acre when they do that. Most people will say that you can add a ewe for every cow and never miss the cow feed. And there's been some pretty good research to show that that's pretty much true. Not precisely, but pretty much true. Now, if you want to add 2 ewes per cow, you're going to have to start reducing the number of cows a little bit. But at about 1 ewe per cow, don't miss the cow feed. But you can look at those other enterprises and which are more profitable. I can just about guarantee you that today sheep and goats are more profitable than cows. That won't always be true probably, but today it kind of is if you know how to do sheep and goats. Now, in the cattle, you got various enterprise considerations. A yearling operation, stocker operation, in 8 years and 10 is more profitable than the cow-calf operation. Now, I don't know if that's because the quality of managers that manage stockers is higher than the quality of the managers that run cows and calves, or what. Probably not. But stocker operations are usually more profitable than mother cow operations. Then I can go a step further. A terminal operation where you buy replacement cows and sell all the calves every year is more profitable than a maternal operation. The maternal operation being the operation where you generate and make your own replacement heifers. And there's one big unless. Unless the guy that's maternal exposes and breeds almost all of his heifers, doesn't have to get near all of them pregnant, but you get a lot of them pregnant, and you allow pregnant heifers to go into your herd in big numbers so that you can sell bred cows before they get too old at a nice premium. And then you can compensate for the space that those yearlings took as they were growing and developing and not bringing you in any revenue at all for that year. See, in a terminal operation, every cow could be bringing a calf in that year. So you got to replace that revenue. And if I keep every cow until she's a cull, I've not captured any of that increase in value that she's got. And so the only way that the maternal operator, the guy that keeps his own replacement heifers, can compete with a terminal crosser is if he can sell bred cows. And I did a lot of that. I had ranches that were under my management that were terminal operations. Sent cows to them from another ranch at a premium. They had to put them on their books at a premium. And I had ranches that kept their own replacement heifers, generated a bunch of cows, bred cows, and we could sell bred cows to other people, and on our case to a couple of sister ranches. And I had occasion to oversee some of those sister ranches, and the terminal ranches, the only reason they weren't more profitable than our maternal operations was because the maternal operations could move the replacement cows at a premium price. If they'd been selling them on the market, the terminal operations would have beat us every year. So, and I've done that arithmetic over and over again. I can just tell you that's the way it is. So if you're going to raise your own replacement heifers and keep them, you better figure out a way to sell bred cows, good bred cows. Okay. So enterprise mix really becomes important. Your choice of that becomes very important to your profitability. Overheads. We've talked about that, so we won't talk about it anymore. Stocking rate. Stocking rate has two huge dependencies. The first one, cow size and milking ability. We have already talked about cow size a little bit. Cow size is smaller. If they give less milk, they eat less feed, I can run more of them. Yeah, they need milk, but they only need enough milk to get started, develop their own immune system, get going. There's such a thing as excess milk that starts taking away from the fertility of the cow, the number that you can run, because milk doesn't come from the clear blue sky. It comes out of that cow eating more feed, making more milk. And the conversion of grass into the cow to milk out of the cow to calf growth rate from having consumed that milk is a poor conversion. It's not a very good conversion of pounds of grass to pounds of calf as it goes through the cow. It's a poor conversion. So we can sure ask for too much milk. And grazing and pasture management, and that's the big hitter. And I hope that you can kind of zero in on that. As determinants of profit, stocking rate is one of the big ones. And its biggest determinant really is grazing and pasture management. You can, over time, you can double and triple stocking rate. Can't do it quickly. You got to be able to produce more grazable feed first. But over time, you can greatly increase your carrying capacity and then follow that with increased stocking rate. Now, what did I just say? Increased carrying capacity, which is the supply. Stocking rate is the demand. I can't increase the stocking rate before I've increased, or the demand before I've increased the supply. I've got to produce more feed before I can graze more feed, right? So carrying capacity comes first and then stocking rate afterward. But grazing and pasture management, and folks, if you've not seen that happen, if you haven't had those experiences, that's probably hard to believe. But I've lived long enough and been in enough places and managed in enough places to know that it's absolutely true, that it can happen. And we'll share another story or two as we go through here today. But that can for sure happen. Fed feed versus grazed feed. I like to say it this way. Every day that a cow can graze and I don't have to feed her is a day that I've saved money. Even if the quality of what she grazes isn't as good as what I might feed her. The cost of operating that machine and equipment, putting hay in a package that's feedable and then feeding it back out, that's why my friend in Wyoming swath grazes. He only has to one or maybe two pieces of equipment, and after that, he doesn't have to start an engine in the wintertime. The cows go out and feed themselves. And he does some things with electric fencing in the wintertime so that they just have a portion of that available to them for 2 or 3 days and then moves it on so he can graze it sensibly. But bale grazes, swath grazes, and just greatly reduces the need for equipment. So fed feed versus grazed feed, a hugely important ratio. And calving season, and I'll show you a slide or two in a bit. But if I don't know your weather here well enough, but if you calve in February and you don't get green up until April, you're going to have to feed that cow a whole lot more than if she calves in April. So picking the calving season can become really important to the economics of the cattle business. Realized herd fertility. Why did I put that word realized on there? Because I want something to sell. A conception occurs, and for every one that occurs, there's some embryonic death loss. First of all, that none of us ever recognized. It wasn't big enough, and we just think she never got pregnant. Then we know there's some slinks, abortions, whatever you call them, that the cow loses her calf during pregnancy. And then we have death losses when the calves are born. And then we have summer pneumonia or whatever, and critters die. Ideally, which we'll never get to, but ideally, every single conception would result in an animal to sell. So the higher we can make that realized fertility, the more profitable we can become. It's just one more animal that we get to sell for every one of those. Then wise input use for optimum production. And I'm not much of an input user. I don't mean to offend any of you out there that sell inputs, but and I've got a rule of thumb. If I can't estimate fairly conservatively that I can at least get twice as much back from the use of an input as I paid for it, I don't want to use it. And you might say, why? And I'm going to say, because we're not very good estimators. Either the guy selling me that input or me as a user of that input. How do I know? How do I really know how much I'm going to get? So I want my best estimate. I want to say I'm going to get at least double, because if I overestimated, or the person selling me the input probably did overestimate, you know, how much have we overestimated? And so I want some leeway to cover that. And then the other thing, you know, critters, cattle at least, they kind of get addicted to these inputs. They become dependent upon them, and now the price of it goes way up, and I got to start backing it away. And now my cattle are dependent on them. What's my cull rate going to be now when I have to start taking that away from them? You know, that gets to be pretty important too. So those two factors, I want to think I'm going to get at least twice back what the cost of what that input's going to cost me to use. And one of the things we're finding in regenerative management is that we start reducing the need for inputs. And it's not instantaneous, but it happens, and it happens fairly quickly in a lot of cases, that we can start reducing the use of inputs, the need for inputs, and we do just as good without them as we did with them. And so that becomes really a really critical factor. And then marketing, and we've talked about marketing, so I won't say more about that here. Okay, there's these things here that are important. I'm beginning to summarize what I've just told you to this point. So if you've got questions in a minute, well, I want you to ask them. Adapted cows, calving season, grazing management. Haven't talked about how to get adapted cows, but I want cows that are adapted to the environment. Now, when you walk outside here, you face one environment, right? And if you walk out there 365 days a year, you kind of have a feel for what the natural environment is here. But that cow's environment isn't just that natural environment. It's what you add to it. That makes sense? How much feed are you throwing out there? What are immunizations? What are supplements? What are lice and grub control, worm control, etc.? What are you doing in addition to that natural environment? And that's the cow's environment. I want to get the cows adapted to that, and I want to start taking inputs away. And as I take those inputs away, that cow's environment's getting a little tougher. Can she deal with that? So I want a cow that's adapted to that environment. And then grazing management. Adapted cows, calving season, grazing management. Those three things will have effects on soil health, carrying capacity, fed feed versus grazed feed, overheads, the needs for overheads, labor and facilities, and herd fertility. They have an effect on every one of them. And some of these will have effects on each other. We need to learn how to see those effects, how to anticipate them. And I kind of call that systems thinking. So anyway, so what we've set up to date, if you can do this is summary. Now it's not my grand summary, I got a lot more to talk about, but to summarize up to this point, and it really is the grand summary, but we'll go back and add a little detail, put a little meat around the bones. Reduce overheads, achieve excellent herd fertility, market well, and then improve these three key ratios. Acres per cow, okay. If it takes me 30 acres to run a cow now, I think you guys are quite a bit better than that here, but I know some place takes 30 acres to run a cow, typically. If I can change that to 15, that's a huge economic switch. Huge. Cows per person. I know I'm not politically correct there, but I couldn't get person to fit on there. So anyway, cows per person, and then fed feed versus grazed feed. If I can change those ratios favorably, that's hugely powerful economically. So that's what we want our management to start to do. That's what we want our management to start to do, and that hinges a lot right here on acres per cow. If I can diminish that, And I didn't increase the size of my ranch, but now say I'm running twice as many cows. I'll show an example in Montana in a bit. He did that. And he didn't have to add a tractor, he didn't have to add an employee, he didn't have to add a saddle horse, he didn't have to add anything. As a matter of fact, he reduced winter hay feeding in the process of all of that. So he saved some there too. And he said the only thing I had to add was on the days we worked cattle. Actually took them to the pens and worked them. And he said that's only 4 or 5 times a year at the most. Then he said we either had to stay longer or we had to have a little more neighbor help come or hire a little more day help to get that cow working done that day. But other than that, nothing changed. Think of the power of that. And that went down to here, right? As he cut the number of acres per cow in half, that economic change went down to here. Didn't have to add any manpower. Same number of herds to tend. Guy goes the same place, tends the same cattle, does the same thing, make sure they got water, make sure they got feed, make sure they're where they belong. And you do whatever moving you're doing for grazing management. And you've got it done. Fed feed versus graze feed, and like I say, he reduced the amount of feeding he was doing, wintertime feeding he was doing, because his grazing management was enough better to compensate. He could stockpile winter graze, and they were grazing it instead of him having to feed it. So very, very important economic ratios. Now, 5 essentials. I should have shut my phone off, shouldn't I? I'll make it quiet. I hope. Anyway, somebody said Ron Bowles is going to come down here to talk, in a month or so. Ron and I have been good friends for a long time, and the way we first met, Ron called me up years ago, and he was an extension man in Kansas at the time. You guys, some of you are probably old enough to remember that. And he called me up and he wanted me to join a speaker panel, and he had two sets of speakers, and he put us on this road show. And one set of speakers would speak in the morning to one group, and another group would come to there about noontime and have lunch with him and speak. And then the morning group, in the meantime, had moved on to a lunch group, and they'd have lunch and speak there. And then the group that started at noon, they moved in the evening to talk to the group that, well, you follow me kind of. Anyway, one group just followed another, and we did that for about 4 days, so we gave talks about 8 times. The topic he gave me was, would you make a list of 10 things that you think have helped you most as a manager in the last 5 or 6 years? Interesting that he gave the same topic to a whole bunch of people, the very same topic. And I got a phone call one day. I didn't realize that until I got a phone call one day. And a good extension guy, a really good one, in fact, up in western Nebraska, called me up and he said, hey, did Bowles ask you to talk at his traveling road show down in Kansas? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, got this nutritionist in here with me. And I knew her too, a lady who worked for Elanco, PhD nutritionist. He says, he's given us the same topic. He said, doesn't that worry you a little bit? And I said, no. And I think that offended him. I didn't mean to, but I said no. And he said, well, why not? And I said, well, I'm not going to talk about the same things you guys talk about. I'm sure of that. And I didn't. And so anyway, we gave our talks. They gave good talks, by the way. But we gave our talks, and and my talk was particularly well received, and I got lots of questions and so forth and so on, lots of discussion. And afterward, I just kept thinking about this talk because I fairly frequently got invited to give talks. And even though I was young and not very smart yet, but I got thinking about this list of 10, and I can't even remember it precisely. I can remember some of it. But I narrowed it down to these 5 essentials, and I'll be honest with you, I think they are the essentials. I've given it a lot of thought. And it's your approach to management. Now, I've talked about other things about management up to now in this talk, but these are the way you should approach your job as a manager. And I think if you can do that, you will be a better manager. But first of all, your approach needs to be both integrative and holistic. Enough has been talked about being holistic. I'm not sure we all get a grasp of that. Some people will call it being a systems thinker. In business circles, we talk more about systems. In biological groups, we talk more about holistic. But they're close enough to the same that I'm not going to argue over the differences or the semantics. Systems approach to management, or a holistic approach to management, where you see as many as you possibly can the interconnections between all that we do. So much interconnectedness. And we need to learn to see as much of that as we can. We'll never be perfect at it. Integrative, well, we sort of get there by integration means we learn the bits and the pieces. What do you learn in a college course on nutrition or on genetics or on accounting or on business management? What do you learn when you come to something like this, or that are sponsored by other people? What do you learn if you go to a Soil Health Academy course for 3 days? Or for those who come to the workshop next week, what do you learn there? And how do you combine all these pieces, and how do you see the interconnectedness of all of those things? That is integration. As you learn in bits and pieces, it becomes holistic as you begin to see how they all meld together, work together, how the synergies are involved from one to another, and that's when you become holistic. And so your approach to management needs to be both integrative to give you the basis and the basics and the general understanding, and then holistic so you see all the pieces and the parts and how they relate to each other, how they affect each other. Our colleague, Alan Williams, he says that there are no singular effects in all of biology. You make one change and there's not just a singular effect, there are multiple effects. And he says you just initiate compounding and cascading effects. They compound because they affect more than one thing, they affect several, and then those things affect each other, and that's how they begin to cascade and roll forward. We could talk about a number of examples of systems thinking. Cattle size and growth rate, just for example. For years, people wanted bigger weaning weights, right? They wanted bigger weaning weights, and they bought bulls that had big weaning weights, and they bought semen from bulls that had big weaning weights. And they go through 10, 15 years, and okay, we got bigger weaning weights. What happened to cow size in the meantime? It went up, you know. Somehow, I guess we had in our mind that we can just get this bigger calf and nothing will happen with the cow. She'll eat the same amount of feed as she always has. We'll be able to run the same number of them as we always have. Then people get ticked off out west because they run on BLM and Forest Service land. They want to keep cutting their permit back because they're starting to overgraze. Well, the same number of cows as we've always run. Yeah, but you're taking more feed than you've ever taken because the cows are bigger. And, you know, sometimes we have trouble getting that through our mind, especially if we want to keep running the same number of cows. But so, you know, cattle size and growth rate, see, they're compounding things that we've got to, our systems thinking mind has to start taking those into account. Same thing with milking ability. I talked about milking ability, so we won't talk about it more, but same thing. Heterosis, hybrid vigor. I love hybrid vigor. I love heterosis. And years ago, I got introduced to crossbreeding data of some of the very first done in America, before Clay Center even, Fort Robinson, Nebraska. And they crossbred Hereford, Angus, and Shorthorn. Those are the only breeds they had, except for maybe a few Charolais, unless they wanted to use Jersey and Guernsey and Holstein, but they didn't want to incorporate those. So there's Hereford, Angus, and Shorthorn, and they made all the possible F1s that they could. So they had crossbred calves, but half of the cows of each of the three breeds were bred to have a straight bred calf. So they could take these crossbred calves and compare them to straight bred calves. Well, they found out that they weaned about 8% more pounds of calf per cow with a straight bred cow having a crossbred calf at side than if she had a straight bred calf at side. Now, it wasn't all in the pounds of calf, but there were a few more calves because they survived a little better. Survivability was just a little better. But then now they take these crossbreds, and remember, they're still maintaining straight bred calves out of straight bred cows, but now they take the crossbred cow and breed herd of the third breed. When they did that, they got 23%, between 21 and 23% more pounds of calf per cow carried on the ranch. How'd they get that? A few more of them got pregnant of the crossbred cows. The cows probably gave a little more milk, and the calves grew a little faster. Those numbers, they just stuck out to me and they overwhelmed me with these breeds that are fairly similar in size back in the day. How do you get 21 to 23% more? But they were doing it. It was well documented. I mean, it was good quality, well done research. One of my professors had introduced me to this thing, and you know, at the same time I was sitting in on, I was faculty member at the University of Wyoming, and master's degree people didn't get to do that very often, but I got to do it for 1 year. And I was sitting in on an animal breeding class. Boy, I'd go back to my office and I'd start playing around with designing crossbreeding programs. The crossbreeding programs I was going to put into effect when I became a ranch manager. Well, a few years later, I became a ranch manager. And you know what I learned? I learned it was a whole lot more difficult to put those programs on the ground than it was to write them out on a piece of paper. Because to maintain 100% heterosis, you got to keep going to the next breed of bull. And how many breeds am I going to go through? Now, Simmental and Gelbvieh and Limousine, and those were showing up about that time in my career. And I could have kept going to a different breed and a different breed and a different breed, but that's going to be a self-defeating deal too. But Clay Center came to my rescue and they developed this thing called a composite. And they showed us that we could maintain not full heterosis, not complete heterosis, but we could maintain an optimum level of heterosis that you could breed the same bull to the same cow, same breed of bulls, same breed combination of bulls, same breed combination of cows, over and over, and that would maintain, the heterosis would maintain itself through generations. And so I started doing just that. But what I had to learn, as I got my systems thinking hat on, I can't have it all. And then about that time, I started to get indoctrinated into grazing, good grazing. And as I graze better, I need these paddocks. I'm going to move the cattle quite often. Well, I don't want to have 3 different breeding herds that I got to track. I want to be able to throw those cows all in the same herd to minimize my efforts in fencing and cow care and so forth and so on. So again, just examples of systems thinking. Calving season. When I was a kid, here we are, 6,200 feet elevation in Wyoming, and with snow like this in most winters. I mean, typically deep snow. And we're trying to calve in late February and March. Our calving seasons usually had ended before the snow was all gone. You could probably pay me enough to get me to do that again, but it'd have to be an awful lot of money. And because I do know how to do it. I just don't want to ever do it again. And you know, and it just made no sense. And it took me too many years to understand that it didn't make any sense. But we were doing it because we thought we would wean a bigger calf in the fall. Yeah, we probably did wean a bigger calf in the fall. But how much more winter hay did we have to feed? The day a cow calves, her nutrient requirement almost doubles. Not quite, but almost. And on the quality of feed that most of us ranchers have, she can't eat enough of that feed for her nutrient intake to double. So, you know, that works into some later conception problems and everything else. So you got, you know, again, to be a systems thinker, to be a holistic thinker, we've got to take all that into consideration. Wormers and insecticides. Okay. None of you guys have ever wormed your cows, ever. Now, half of you are going to start to worm them and treat them for flies and use the various and sundry things out there that you can do to take care of those problems. And the first year, you're going to have a nice little increase in performance. You can go to the coffee shop and brag about it and say, boy, we used this stuff and here's what we got, and it was pretty good. The other guys, they still kind of stubborn. They're not going to change. And but you know, the question I keep asking myself, what if 10 years down the road, now you were to compare those two sets of ranchers, the one that continued never to treat for worms, flies, insecticides, and the other kept on doing it? How much difference would there be in their performance after 10 years? You know, I don't know the answer to that question, but my guess is there wouldn't be near as much as there was in years 1, 2, and 3. But the thing I do know, in these herds where they had never used any of that stuff, and if they're culling the right cows, their cattle are little by little are becoming or staying resistant to those pests. And where you've been treating them, they have no reason to become resistant to those pests because you've taken care of the pests, so they no chance to develop genetic resistance. And so you've just put into motion a foot race between the chemical makers and the pests. What's going to happen faster? Are they going to develop a new chemical that'll be more effective on the next generation of pests? Or are the pests going to develop resistance faster and not be affected by the use of the chemicals? Well, there's all kinds of evidence of that having happened. Isn't there? Lots of it. I mean, fly tags, not near as effective as they used to be. Just all kinds of things. I was in a seminar years ago and was asked to give a keynote talk, and I don't know why. They called it Fair 2002. It was preceding the 2005 Farm Bill, and I was asked to sit with a group, and in that group we got discussing all kinds of things about weeds. And why I was in that group, I don't know. But anyway, the subject of Roundup came up. Boy, how wonderful this product was. You know, it was inert when it hit the ground. It killed everything green. You know, use it at the right time. And then I said, well, and they were talking about Roundup Ready corn and how that would work and be so cool. And I said, okay, so what are you going to do when you get Roundup Ready weeds? And they said, well, that'll never happen in our lifetime. And I said, well, you know what? I said, I believe it will. I said, I hope you're right and that I'm wrong, but I believe that you'll have Roundup Ready weeds in not only your lifetime, my lifetime too. Well, do we have Roundup Ready weeds? We do, don't we? And so we keep adding to the mix, you see. How long can that go on? When nature has its own cures if we use them. A lot of its own cures if we learn how to work in nature's image. So, you know, just those are a few examples of systems thinking. We've got to think beyond. We've got to think about the interactions and I've used simplified ones. They become much more complex than that. So production systems and marketing, all this, we've got to become systems thinkers. And you synchronize all of that and even more. These major determinants of profit, they all interact with each other. There's a lot of interaction between these lines that as a holistic thinker, we need to be able to see those. So for profitable decision making, become a systems thinker. Become integrative and holistic in your thought processes. Before we jump into this next one, any questions on that so far, on things we've talked about? Don't hesitate to ask. Okay, number 2, the first essential, be both integrative and holistic. Second one, strive for continuous improvement of the key resources, land, livestock, and people. If those are improving all the time, you will become better. Your operation will become better, will become more profitable. For improvement of land and soil, I like to use adaptive multi-paddock grazing. And I wish I had a few slides in here that I used to show, but I deleted them for one reason or another. But continuous improvement of the land through adaptive grazing will improve the land and it'll improve the soil. It'll improve over time, will improve your carrying capacity, you'll get a greater stocking rate, and you'll have better animal performance, which means better fertility, better growth rates, and better herd health. Without changing the size of the cow. All those things will just start to increase and get improvement in context. Now, this is an old Fred Provenza concept. Sometimes when you initiate these changes, and here you've run your cattle in continuous grazing, and now I bunch them together, and I start moving them for good grazing, there can be a little biological dip. And it happened to me, but I wasn't as smart then as I am now. I hope, at least I hope I'm smarter now. But our cattle, our conception rates and our weaning weights both dropped a little. I went to some of my friends that have been grazing pretty good for several years, And I said, hey, I got to quit. I lost conception rate, lost weaning weight. And they said, no, don't quit. That'll change. You'll come back out. They'll get as good as and then get better than they were before. And I said, well, I'm glad you told me that. I wish you'd have warned me before. But anyway, and it did happen just like they said it would. It got better. But the second group of cattle that I introduced to better grazing, the dip was still there, but smaller, lasted less time. And you get to where you get good at it, the cattle get good at it, and you can make the switches without being a big problem. But basically, you can count on those things all improving. Somewhere in southeast Montana, this is the guy I told you about. Didn't have to add a man, didn't have to add a saddle horse. Changed it from 30 acres per cow to 16 acres per cow, and the cows were a little bigger, so he said, I know I at least doubled my carrying capacity. You think of the economics of that, I mean, it's just pretty fantastic. There's a guy named Steve Freeman over in Missouri. Just might be the best grazer I've ever known. He's really, really good. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with that fescue country over there, but a lot of people say once you've got fescue, that's what you've got. He's getting the polyculture in his fescue. I mean, he's got other warm season grasses coming into the polyculture. These heifers, this is in April. There's not a leaf on the tree yet, and see how tall the grass is. I drove away from his place and I noticed the neighbor's grass, and it was, just not more than that at best. And I thought, I'll bet those guys look at Steve and say, I'll bet he spends a lot on fertilizer to get grass like that in April. The only fertilizer that grass gets is what comes out of the back end of the cows. When he started with that, he was over 6 acres per cow. He's now just under 2, about 1.9 acres per cow. So tremendous improvement, and he's getting over time a multi-species sward, not just straight fescue. And so that's a really encouraging thing for them. Mississippi, the interesting story about these people is that they were doing what the neighbors were doing. To get winter feed, they're south of the fescue belt, and so they lightly disc a bunch of their warm season grass country, and then they would plant rye in it and fertilize the rye real good. And he got tired of it. He said, there's got to be a better way, and he heard about cover crops. And so he bought a good no-till drill, and he began to seed into his warm season grasses as they started to go dormant. He didn't want them still trying to grow. They'd be too much competition. But as they started to go dormant, he seeded into them warm season grasses, forbs, and legumes. He doesn't put many legumes anymore because they're self-seeding. They perpetuate. So some forbs and some grasses, which oats and rye were typically his grasses, and seed those, and he reduced about 2/3 of what had been his cost. So for about 1/3 of what he used to spend, he's now spending on the operation of the no-till drill and the seed, and doesn't buy near the feed supplement, doesn't buy any fertilizer, and has just gone ahead in a marvelous way. And that's some of his feed, and I say you could make your own salad out of that. You don't need to depend on the cows to eat it, but just the stuff that they're eating is just wonderful in the middle of winter, when down there they were depending on the rye that they were having to fertilize, or they were having to buy in supplements. And so he had that as a, and he's convinced that his summer productivity is improved, of the warm seasons has improved as a result of this, functioning roots in the soil during the wintertime, and thus more soil microbial activity going on. So now he's part of the McDonald's project that maybe some of you have heard about, and in that group they took carbon measurements in the soil, organic matter measurements. Organic matter is what I should say. Organic matter measurements, and his was about 3x what the neighbors were. They compared both. They went around the neighbors and found about 17 species of birds on the neighbor's property. On his, it was well over 100. And that's so huge it's almost unimaginable that they were finding birds attracted to his place. Story that he tells, army worms were coming across the rye on the neighbors. This was early on in his practice of doing this, and here come the army worms marching across the field, taking all of the rye that had been planted and fertilized and growing. And he had the cover crops on his. Went and told his wife, he said, I'm going to have to spray for those army worms. And she says, no, Cooper, you said when we did this that you weren't going to spray for army worms ever again. And he said, well, okay. Well, a day or two later, they're just about right on him, and he said, I think we better spray for those worms. No, you're not going to spray for those. So she convinced him. He didn't spray for the worms. He said, you know, when those darn worms didn't come onto our place, they quit. Well, a good entomologist that quite a few of us have worked with, he said, Cooper, I hate to tell you this, but a few of those army worms did come onto your place, and you should be glad that they did, because their predator is there, and their predator needs something to eat, so the predator will always be there. But he said, not near as many came, and he said, you know why they didn't come? He said, your environment is so full of insects, most of them beneficial, and a lot of them benign, don't have a positive or a negative effect that we can determine. But he said, it's just an inhospitable place for those army worms to be. And he says, that's why they're not coming in there. And so he's never sprayed for army worms now in the many years, well, quite a few years that he's been doing this. So there's just input cost that he doesn't spend anymore. This Emery Birdwell and Deborah Clark in Texas, they put 6,000 head of stocker cattle together in a single mob, move them up to 6 times a day. And their grassland is just getting better and better and better. Two interesting things there. One is that, you know, they've invited a lot of native species back. They're seeing eastern gamma, which people in that area hadn't seen for years and years and years. The other thing, he waters them. He splits a long propane tank in 2, and he waters them around that propane tank. It's probably not much longer than me to the other side of this first table here, long, and cattle can get on either side of it. And he said, they don't all have to get up there. All 6,000 don't have to get up there once. He says they got their pecking order worked out. They're perfectly willing to take turns. He said, but if they stick their head in there to drink, there better be water for them to drink, because they go crazy if there's not. He said, if the water, my source has to have rapid inflow, because there'll be a pretty good number of cattle around there, and he said they all got to be able to drink as fast as they want to drink. And he said, if water can hit the other end of the tank all the time, he said, I've got enough water. And so that's what he gauges it on, and he's got a float on it, so if it does fill up, it'll stop. But if that float's open, why, the water's going to hit the other end of the tank and they can all drink. So that's one thing a lot of people worry about. How many cattle can drink around one water? A pretty big herd can drink around this table if there's water there every time. So your recharge rate has to be dependable, has to be good. But a lot of cattle can drink there. Okay, so we want to continuously improve the land. Now the livestock. I want cows selected for this, but most of my ranching has been north of I-80, and we get a lot of this. You might not get so much of this, but what am I talking about here? It really doesn't matter. It can be in Georgia or Texas or wherever. And I've been in those places, made this presentation. I said, we don't get this here. No, but you have 2, maybe 3 months of the year that are the toughest times of the year for your cattle. Pick those times and say, okay, how do I select cattle that are adapted to this, to my toughest times of the year? How do I select cattle that fit that? And then you color right cow. The ones that come up characterized this way in your environment, remember it's a natural environment plus what you add to it. And then you take off the opens and the dries, those that require your assistance or attention, the wild ones, the ones that raise a poor calf, and the uglies. Be a little easy on ugly. Man, if she can get pregnant every year on time and raise a decent calf and never get sick, she can't be too ugly. But certain marketability and things like that you start to consider here, okay? But only to the extent you have room to do that, that you can replace the others that you've already had to cull from that list. And then you might have the luxury to cull a few uglies. And then select the right bull, and be really careful with this. Mature size, moderate or small. People ask me, well, what do you call moderate? And I said, well, I'll tell you what. If you think a 1,400 cow is moderate, you better look for small. I'm not sure everyone caught that, but get them moderate or small. Don't want the huge ones. Most people have and even want too much milk production in their cows. You want excellent cow fertility. And then care requirement. Okay, I'm a cow-calf guy. I love cows and calves, and I love to make and sell good bred cows. It's just kind of a passion of mine. But I start reading newspaper articles, and boy, they start coming at you already for this winter. How do I take care of the bull this winter so we can get cows pregnant next summer? And I think, you know, that darn bull, he doesn't have to gestate, he doesn't have to lactate. He's got a pretty easy life. Why do I have to pamper that bull so he can get cows pregnant next summer? Do I want his daughters as my replacement heifers if I have to take that kind of care of him? And my answer to that question is no, not if I'm raising replacement heifers that I want to become good cows with good stability, good longevity. A bull's going to be the last thing I take good care of. Now, for years I turned them out in the pasture in Nebraska, western Nebraska. And I gave them a little protein supplement so they could graze and convert the dry feed that they were grazing. Sandhills grass. They were the last thing we fed. First thing we fed was a pregnant yearling that was going to have her first calf. Next thing we fed were our heifer calves in development. The next we might feed the cow herd if it got really tough. And the last thing we fed was the bulls. They were just on the low order because I want those bulls to be tough, and if they flunk their BSE next spring, so what? They flunked their BSE and bye-bye. You know, and we produced most of our own bulls, and we did it because we wanted environmentally adapted cattle. And we learned that if the calves that were sired, the heifer calves that were born to our bulls and our cows were a little better, not a lot better, but a little better than the calves born to our cows and an AI sire that we'd use semen from. And our daughter retention was better if both sides of the pedigree were from ours. So care requirement. What does it take to keep that bull functional? Yeah, we want to keep him functional, but boy, and you know, if you get that horrendous winter or storm or whatever, yeah, take care of him. Help him get through the rough spots. But don't pamper them. Don't take better care of them than you do of your cows. Okay. Continuous improvement of people. And I think that begins with understanding the manager's job. And to me, the manager's job is this: to create an environment in which people want to excel. That's part one. Create an environment in which people want to excel. That gets back to the family relationships I was talking about a bit ago. How do you get everybody on the same page and everybody wants to excel and wants to get really good? There's a little art to that too. But if you can do that, then people are going to get better of their own volition. They'll get better because they want to. And then provide tools and training and freedom to do it. If they don't have good tools, you can't expect them to do a good job. So provide good tools, good training. If you're managing at a level up here and you're hiring people that might have come from a level down here, it is unfair. And that happens most of the time, by the way. If you're a progressive and good manager, you're expecting more of people than they've ever learned to give. Okay? And maybe not physically, not maybe in arms and legs, but in heart and mind. And so you're expecting more of them, and to not train is unfair. To not train is unfair to them. They need to be trained, they need to be shown how to do things correctly and to do it right. And then freedom, and freedom is the reward. You know, autonomy, if you pay people adequately, pay them a fair wage to begin with. Once you're at that level of pay, from then on, autonomy, additional autonomy is every bit as rewarding to them every bit as motivating to them as an increase in pay. And so, you know, we need to remember that. And then leadership best engaged by the voluntary response of those being led. You notice I circled voluntary. If it's not voluntary, it's not leadership. You might call it pushership, you might call it coercion, but not leadership. And it's best gauge. I don't know how to define leadership, but that's how you gauge it. That's how you know when it's leadership. Okay, 5 essentials. Use of good planning and decision-making tools. I'm going to go over this quickly. But you need some good financial records. And I like to have good separation of direct and overhead costs for reasons that we talked about earlier. And I like to have a complete sales list of every sale that occurred that year. And in some detail. That helps me with future budgeting when I have that. Good production records, animal days per acre, weaned calf crop percentage. That's the one place SPA goofed up. I don't know how many are familiar with SPA, standardized performance analysis, but I don't like their calves weaned per cow exposed. Conceptually it's sound, but practically it's nonsense. I've got a guy managing cows, and I want him to think of carrying these cows this year on this year's budget, and I want him to get the cows pregnant to have a calf next year, and I want them to wean the calf that they have at side this year. So that's two years calf crop. I don't want to have to think cows exposed in the previous year. So I take a weaned calf crop percentage. How many pregnant cows did I have when calving season started? How many calves did I wean at the end of the season? Divide one by the other, that's my weaned calf crop percentage. Easy number to get, and count it and get it quickly. Pregnancy rate, how many cows did I palpate? How many were pregnant? Or how many cows did I ultrasound? How many were pregnant? Easy numbers. Now if I want a proxy, so I can compare with my people who did the SPA analysis religiously and perfectly and everything else. If I want to have a proxy, and it's not quite as accurate, but it's pretty close, to calves weaned per cow exposed, I can take this year's weaned calf crop percentage and multiply it by last year's pregnancy rate, which I probably stored someplace, and I've got a pretty good proxy for calves weaned per cow exposed. And so that'll help you through that one. Weaning weights and yearling gain. I want to know what they are, and when I say weaning weights, it's not individual calf. I couldn't care what the individual weighed. How much did my herd of calves weigh? All of them put together. What did I harvest from my ranch this year? It was yearling gain, or it was pounds of calf weaned. Put the two together, that's my production. And I want to see that number increasing over time. And then I want to know what my death losses are. Our electronics, everything we've got, computers, tablets, cell phones, they just help us do all this stuff with much more ease than ever before. I like to start with a flow chart, a cattle flow chart, to start a budget. It tells me where my animals, what classes I had at the beginning of the year, what were added, what were subtracted, what I sold, and then from that I can build my feed budget because I know how many cattle I'm going to carry. I know how many I'm going to sell, so I can develop my sales budget. If you start with that, you know, if any of you want copies of that, let me know and I can get you a copy of it. Or I can draw one out for you quickly. But good place to start a budget. Okay, number 5, war on cost. Why a war on cost? The biggest reason is competition. You know, people don't have to eat meat. Probably die young if they don't, but they don't have to eat meat. And if they do eat meat, it doesn't have to be beef. As much as I can't imagine a life on chicken, it doesn't have to be beef. And so, you know, we have a challenge, and the challenge for us, if we think about who consumes our product, and there are people that have passed through before it gets to them naturally, but those people that have passed through before it gets to them all want to make a profit. Some of them are satisfied without making too big a profit, but they all want to make a profit. And we want to make a profit. So what we have to do is we have to produce a product at a price that is attractive to our customer and at the same time profitable to us. Attractive to the customer and profitable to us. Now that means we've got to wage war on cost because we're each other's competitors, right? We like each other, we're good friends, we don't look at each other as a competitor necessarily, but we are. The person who can produce a pound of calf for 10 for 10 cents a pound less than his neighbor gets to stay in business longer, you know, when the tough times come. So it becomes really, really important. So we've talked about overheads, we've talked about gross margin. You know, if we're going to spend $1, we want more than $1 back, quite a bit more than $1 back actually. So how do I get too efficient with my cows? Now this is taken in January. Cows are in pretty decent condition, aren't they? And we're asking them to eat what you see in front of them there. Now this picture, those cows happen to be on a pasture that had been grazed by yearlings in the summertime, and we just let them kind of high grade the pasture, the best stuff, and it's usually the stemmy stuff, the more rigid stuff that stood up through the snow. But those cows get down under there and you can see laid at their feet, if I can get the pointer to point. But right in here you can see stuff kind of laid down, they'll eat on that stuff. They still trample a lot, so there'll still be good litter on the ground next spring. But we expect them to eat that and survive in the wintertime. So adaptation of the environment, that's what we're talking about. And that's part of the way you get too efficient. Cattle that are adapted. The way the guy started there, my predecessor, I managed that place for the last 5 years of my career. Well, I didn't manage it, I oversaw the manager. And the manager that I oversaw was the guy I was telling you that did all the swath grazing and cut the overheads, and you know, he was lucky that the right people left when they left him. He was my manager on that place we were just looking at right there. And so anyway, but a predecessor of ours, and some of you have heard of him, Greg Simon. He's almost a wild man in management, but boy, he's smart. But he was just having fallout rates because he was getting tough on the cows. He was making them graze longer than they'd ever grazed in their lives, feeding far less hay. They had 8,000 irrigated acres. They used to hay the entirety of it and feed that hay out in the wintertime. Put it all up in the summertime, feed it back in the wintertime. You can imagine there's probably 2 months of the year that they're not either putting hay in or taking hay out. And he didn't want to do that anymore, and he said, let's get cattle that are adapted, that don't have to have all of this. And so he said, we got these 10-year-old cows and they're older. Let's raise bulls out of those cows, because we never kept them if they were open. We've never kept them if they were dry. Started raising bulls out of those cows, and voila, the heifer calves that were born now, they start being much more efficient, much more better suited to the environment than calves from bulls they've been buying. So you're matching cow size and calving season, the available resource. If you were going to calve those cows in February back there, I couldn't feed them like that. You know, you just couldn't do it. Okay. So increasing grazing days and reduced feeding days, we've talked about that. Minimal development of replacement heifers. I talked about not pampering your bulls. I don't believe in pampering your heifers either. I got to the point that I was keeping almost every heifer calf and exposing them to the bulls for a very short period of time. But that heifer calf had to be a real poor heifer calf, or she got a chance to get exposed to the bull. But we wintered them like this, on grass, fed them maybe 3 pounds of an 18% cake a day, and grazed them. And if the snow got bad or the temperature got real cold, we'd throw hay to them. And so we'd try to take the rough edges off the environment, the very worst conditions, and develop the heifers that way, and then expose a lot of them to the bulls for 24 to 30 days. Started out at 30, worked our way toward 24. And so you can buy small replacements that fit your environment, or raise replacement heifers from bulls and cows that fit your environment. Cut your inputs and then cull the right cow, and we've talked about who those were. Just some advantages. If you're doing good grazing and you're calving in sync with nature, here's a few of the things that happen. But it all requires less labor and less equipment. And you get a higher cows per person ratio when you do all these things. Good. And so then the last emphasis is on marketing. So remember, 1, approach is both integrative and holistic. 2, continuous improvement of the key resources, land, livestock, and people. 3, you acquire and use good planning and decision-making tools. 4 is war on cost. And 5 is an emphasis on marketing. And those, in my mind, are the 5 essentials in your approach to management. Production and marketing must work well together. So after you cut the inputs, I like a short exposure to lots of heifers. Some people will leave a long exposure and then they'll ultrasound pregnancy check and sell the later bred heifers. I've always figured that's an injustice to somebody else, but that's all right. If they're crazy enough to buy them, let them go ahead and buy them. You know, when you sell a bred heifer, let me reverse that. When I buy a bred heifer, I'm buying a heifer that has the 2 toughest years of her life ahead of her. And she's just changed environments from somebody else's to mine. The cull rate's going to be bigger on those heifers in the first 2 years I own them than ever in the rest of their life. Why not let the guy that raised them take that cull rate at his environment, which is going to be less in his environment because they're used to that. And if they want to get a cycle later in their life, let them do it and sell them as a bred cow to somebody. And she'll make a good bred cow that'll stay. But short exposure, lots of heifers, opens make good feeders, and the pregnant ones make good cows. Cows that want a short calving season, a long breeding season, and you say, what? How? And we just left bulls with cows till preg check time. We were calving in April. We'd preg check, and that might have been a little too early, by the way. But we were preg checking in late October, early November. We'd tell the guys doing the pregnancy checking, if you think she got pregnant after the 1st of September, she's open. You just call her open. We'll put her on our books as open. And that's the way our preg rate is calculated. But we knew some of them were pregnant. Some of them were pregnant we couldn't even determine because the bulls came out the same day they were pregged. We had them at the corral, easy time to get the bulls off, and by that time the bulls are satisfied being in a bachelor group. They're not going to fight and mess each other up near as bad. And so we'd pull the bulls out that day, but those cows we would then move into corn stalks on the Platte River. And we would go preg check those cows about mid-December. And if they were pregnant for June and July. And we found a buyer that would buy those cows every year, and he bought them year after year after year. So a nice sale for us. He'd buy them at a not at cull cow price, but at a market price, a bred cow price. Now you can imagine quite a few of them were 2-year-olds that slipped a little that year, or 3-year-olds that slipped a little that year. A few more 4, but most of them then, you know, just kind of evenly spread through the rest of the ages. But they would buy them every year. And then next spring when we'd start to calve, we also put bulls back with them at about Thanksgiving time. And so those cows couldn't be pregged on the middle of December. And so we'd carry those cows till the end of March when the guy didn't want them on his corn stalks any longer. And we'd preg them, and we had a sister ranch in Oklahoma that would buy the pregnant cows then as fall calvers. And they were set up to calve in September, early October. And they would buy them and take them, and they worked pretty good as cows there. Now next spring, we would calve, and we were calving in April, and at the end of April, last day of April or first day of May, whichever happened to be more convenient, we'd put all the cows that hadn't calved into one herd, and then we'd breed those cows to calve again in May, because that's when they were going to calve this year, was in May. We had a friend rancher, he was 100 miles away from us or so, maybe not quite that far, that also calved in May, and he terminal crossed. He just bought replacement cows, and he came and bought those cows from us every single year. And he bought them off the end of the preg chute. We'd weaned the calf was ours, he took the pregnant cow. And so basically any cow that hadn't calved in the first 30 days for us was going to be sold before our next calving season. And so it kept us in a real nice tight spot, and about 87% of our cows were calving in the first 30 days of our calving season when we got down to doing that. And so think of the marketing things that happen there. And you know, then you put these charts together. They're all interactive, and we got to be able to see them as that. These are again your major determinants, and I think they are the major determinants, and I don't have weaning weight on there. Why don't I have weaning weight on there? Because weaning weight always comes with a cost. Sometimes the cost comes in terms of more dry cows. Sometimes it costs an additional feed support. Not to say that those costs don't sometimes pay, but I don't think additional weaning weight adds very much to profitability. A study was done by David Lallman at Oklahoma State. Good nutritionist. But he surveyed several of the states around. And he found that in those states, as the cows got 100 pounds heavier, they would wean an additional 6 to 17 pounds of calf. They also did some work on the nutritional requirement of those cows and found that it cost about $40 a cow more for each additional 100 pounds that she weighed to get her through winter, to get her around the year, through year on feed. Well, 6 pounds of calf, not even 17 pounds of calf is going to pay for $40. So that just tells you that, you know, you got to be awful careful with your cow size and weaning weights and what weaning weights can do. Weaning weight, yes, it's important, but it's not a major determinant of your profitability. So many other things are so much more important. Again, we've seen this chart. Acres per cow is probably the most important thing on there, and acres per cow comes because of better grazing management and soil health. If you can get the soil health going and get better grazing management going, you just make life so much better and so much easier, and that relates directly to cows per person. If you got fewer acres per cow, one person can take care of more cows. Don't increase the number of bunches, just increase the size of the bunch. So as you develop it, stock water becomes important. Make sure you can deliver. If you're just starting in a grazing program, you're starting to think about water, try to figure out how to have 3 times as much water as what you currently need. Because I think the day will come you'll need that much water to water the number of cows that you can run on that pasture. Okay, adapted cows, three ingredients: adapted cows, calving season, and grazing management. And that they just become so important and have direct effects on the things on the right-hand side there. And the results, you'll get to appropriate cow size if you cull the way it was suggested and manage the way it was suggested, and a stocking rate, and the stocking rate will be greater. You'll have profitable open heifers, and that's the thing I didn't mention. Developing the heifers the way I showed you, where those heifers were in a circle on a cake line, and I said basically they were grazed, they were wintered like a dry wintered stocker animal, not fabulously well, just wintered. And then you breed the ones that, and some of them didn't breed because they maybe needed to go to a feedlot and be fed to be able to be bred, but I didn't want to have to do that. So I said the good ones got pregnant, but the others made good feeder animals. Those heifers were never in a lost position. Our open heifers were always a profitable enterprise for us. They always made money. And we accounted for them separately, so we knew what we'd put into them and what they were bringing back to us from the time they were a weaned calf until they were a sold heifer. And so you want that heifer to be profitable as an open heifer, and ours were. If stocker operations are profitable 8 years, and more profitable than cow-calf 8 years and 10, why isn't an open heifer profitable? She's nothing more than a stocker that had a bull put with her. The only additional cost over stocker heifer is the cost of putting bulls with them. And so, they better be profitable. Less fed feed, more grazing. Again, and that ties back to your grazing management and adapted cows and the appropriate calving season. Those 3 things are so critical. Drought planning flexibility, it gives you that. You can sell things earlier, you can sell your stockers, you can sell the heifers if you have to. You don't want to, but you can sell them if you have to. Or if you can get early enough indication that you're going into drought, sell late calving cows. Maybe you didn't want to sell them until this fall, but sell them now. Market opportunity for bred cows, it gives you that too. Because your calving season is short and you can sell a bred. Somebody's always calving a season later than you are, even if it's fall. Increased profitability, so it just gives you those things. There's just a few things that are more tactical. I've talked to a lot of strategy, but tactical, just things you do on a daily basis. Your basic overall grazing planning is strategic. How's your basic layout of paddocks going to be? How about water? Where is it going to be? All that thought process is strategic. But then you got to do the day-to-day stuff, and that's tactical. Tactical day-to-day. And just graze right. It's a daily effort preceded by good planning. And it's every bit as much art as it is science. Highly dependent on your ability to observe and let that observation become part of your intuition. That you know what you're seeing. You know what you're seeing in front of you. You know what you see, what the cattle have in front of them to eat today, what they ate yesterday, and what they've eaten in days before, and you know how to size the paddocks. You know how to make your moves and make them appropriately. So you can just make it so much better. Color right cow. I don't know if you can see it or not, but right there and right there, I've taken a hog notcher and taken a notch out of the tag. Can you see that? Just notch the corner. That, when I look at that, I just know that she had one problem. I don't know what the problem was. I can probably go back in records and find out. But that means on our place, she could never be the mother of a bull. She had at least one strike against her. We'll keep her, probably, but she'll never be the mother of a bull. If she gets a second notch, she's going to be sold. But that notch, because we maybe had to assist a birth. We maybe had to doctor her calf. We maybe had to doctor her. But any of those things that put a notch in that tag says she can never be the mother bull. She gets two, she's gone. We were about to the point that one notch was going to have them sold. But we hadn't quite got down the string in our culling process that far yet, but we were about to the point that we could do that. So just a convenient way. I didn't have to have a lot of paper records. That notch tag, and since we had them double tagged, that told us a lot of the story. And low stress animal handling techniques, and I'm a real believer in this, you can never get too good. I don't know how many of you have heard of Bud Williams, but I had the privilege of knowing him personally, and a wonderful guy, a little bit gruff. I once told him that he was a lot better with cattle than he was with people, and he said, I know it. And he said, I'm glad I am. But the first time I sat with him was really an interesting story. I saw his name tag in a trade show, and I can't remember where it was. See this name tag, it says Bud Williams, and I said, I suppose you're the Bud Williams. And he said, yeah, I guess I am. I said, would you have a minute? Would you mind visiting with me a little bit? And he says, no. And there was a chair. He was in somebody's trade show booth. He says, there was an extra chair there. He says, let's sit here and talk. And so I sat down and we started to visit. And actually, I'm inquisitive. I started asking him a lot of questions. And he says, hey, the rules of this conversation have got to change. And I said, well, I didn't realize this conversation had rules. And he said, well, it's going to. And I said, okay, so what are the rules? He said, well, I'll tell you what. You're looking for things that you do the same way I do, or close. And he said, you're going to notice some, because if you've been well trained at all, or grew up handling cattle and you were conscientious and tried to do it right, he said, you'll do some things the way I do. But he said, you're going to find two or three of those, and you're going to think you're as good as I am, and you're not. So he was just dead out blunt, you know, but he still kept talking to me. And I visited with him, and we talked about quite a few things that day. And I grew up, I think I was fairly well trained in animal handling, but not near as good as Bud trained. We moved cattle a long ways from a spring range to a summer range, and did that the last week in June, every year of my life till I went away to college. From the time I was old enough to ride a horse and do it. And I can't remember learning how to ride, so that started at a pretty young age. And you know, I was never once, that was a 30-mile trail. And we were moving like 500 pair. Maybe 3 adults and a bunch of grandkids of my grandparents. And I was never once involved in a run back until after I left home. So we knew a little bit about moving cattle. And a run back would have been a disaster once we're up that trail quite a ways. And you know, so we were taught how to prevent run backs. And the first time I was involved in one, I could tell it was going to happen, but I didn't know what to do about it because we were already out. My opportunity to instruct was gone. And I just figured everybody knew how to move cows, for heaven's sakes. But you know, you get people conversing with each other and not paying attention to the cattle, not watching which calves want to run back and riding to them and taking their attention from back and putting it back forward again. Just simple little things that my dad had taught me. But I spent that morning with Bud Williams, however, morning, afternoon, whatever it was, maybe an hour. And I went home, and by that time I was a general manager. I didn't get to ride as much anymore and work cattle as much anymore, but the first time I got horseback, I was instantly better. Instantly better. And the people around me noticed that I was better. And I noticed that I was better. I could just do things with cattle that I'd never been able to do before, I'd never dreamed of doing before, and get them to react to me the way I wanted them to react to me, just quickly and easily. And just a number of things. Then I started watching Bud Williams videos and did it. But so I'm really big on the animal handling. First of all, it keeps your animals quiet. Now a lot of people think it's nothing but quiet and easy, quiet and slow. Bud did not believe in slow. If I asked my cattle to move, I want them to move, he said, and he does. And you do too. If you're going to move cattle, ask them to move and expect them to move. They are going to trail so much better, and leader-follower is going to be so much stronger if they're moving than if they're just poking along. And yeah, quiet, yes. He wants your hands in your pocket or behind your back. And he doesn't want you to make extensions of yourself with a stock prod. And I still do a little of that because I'm slow. I can't get there quite as quick as I want to, and to get my position right. So I let that be part of an extension of my position. I probably shouldn't do that, but I do. But at any rate, it's way more than slow and quiet. And slow is probably not part of it. Way more than just quiet. He doesn't want you to talk at all. And we don't. When it's as quiet as this room when we work in our cattle. The cattle are quiet too if you're quiet. And but anyway, I instantaneously got better, and I can't live long enough to get as good as I'd like to get. I mean, it's really an amazing thing about how the cattle then just begin to handle better, treat better. You know, your sickness goes down, everything goes down. My nephew, he's weaning calves today back in Wyoming. He'll take calves right off the cow, he'll haul them 3 hours, he'll unload them, and he'll put them in a trap that's hot wire fenced. Now the calves are pretty well hot wire broke because they've seen hot wire fences on the range they've come off of. But they'll land them in the trap, and he'll have hay spread for them when they land there. And before he ever lets them eat any of the hay, he starts moving them around that trap. And he wants to be able to move them one way, stop them, turn and move back the other way, and move them every way. Stop, start, move, turn. And he'll work with them maybe a half an hour, but however long it takes to get him to do that. And then tomorrow he'll come out, and if they react nicely to him right at first, he'll bring his dog in, just one dog, and he'll get the dog to get him to do that same thing. Dogs aren't tough on him. The dog's they're reacting to the pressure of the dog. And then maybe third day in or so, he'll do it on his saddle horse, so they can see that bigger pressure, and he'll do the same thing with him. Those calves, you know, I don't know how it's going to be this year, but last year, where's the wood to knock on? They just didn't get sick. You know, if you teach them to handle and you show them where feed and water is and they're comfortable, their probabilities of getting sick are just far, far reduced. And he does that. And so that's kind of it.